Hello and welcome to the Arise interview. 60 minutes of big questions about the big stories from the news and beyond, with fresh insight and critical analysis. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Coming up in the next hour, they call him the big thinker in residence at Oxford University, one of the most accomplished legal minds in the UK, Nigeria and Africa today. The only black man ever to be seriously considered for appointment to the UK's highest law enforcement post of Attorney General. By the age of 42, he was already Queens Counsel in Britain and Senior Advocate of Nigeria, and held 3 postgraduate degrees from Oxford, including a doctorate. Today, Dr. Professor Barrister Fidelis Oditah, QC, SAN, runs a successful legal practice in both Nigeria and the UK. He is our eminent guest on the Arise interview today, and he's coming up in a moment. And so to the illustrious man made globally conspicuous by excellence. It would not be an exaggeration to say that after several years at the highest level of the Chancery Commercial Bar in the UK and Nigeria, a very demanding position that requires the highest legal skills, Fidelis Oditah is today considered to be one of the brightest minds in British and African legal circles, with an encyclopedic knowledge of the law. The respected Chamber's guides to the UK's legal profession, as well as the office of the Lord Chancellor, speak of Professor Oditah in almost reverent terms. There is whispered talk that if Dr. Oditah had chosen to remain in the UK, he could possibly have become Britain's first black Attorney General. Few other Nigerians command that level of international respect. But then he's done it all. Legal practitioner, professor of law, counsel to the Cayman Islands, Hong Kong and Bermuda, consultant to the United Nations on trade law, expert on Nigerian insolvency law, president of the Nigerian branch of the International Law Association. And that's just the tip of the iceberg in a career that's marked him off as hugely distinctive. Here he is speaking recently about corruption in the Nigerian judiciary.
Sympathetic to the judiciary and be circumspect in condemning the judiciary. In addition to that, like most institutions in Nigeria, the judiciary is a subject of poor funding, lack of motivation. The recruitment of judges has not been the best. And so the weaknesses which we see in many institutions also afflict the judiciary. And one has to appraise their performance in that context, given the constraints that they operate under. I know that in December last year, when I went to speak to some of the judges on Anti-Corruption Day on the 9th of December, some of them hadn't been paid for 2 or 3 months. And one has to bear that in mind in saying that the courts are inefficient and the people take bribe. How do you leave an adult man or woman with a family, a senior public official, without payment for 2 or 3 months? It's just a disgrace. It should never happen. But it's just another aspect of our own failing as a nation.
That's Fidelis Oditah, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, Queens Counsel. So who is Fidelis Oditah and where has he come from? Who is he today and how did he get there? Well, let's find out by speaking to the man himself. Professor Dr. Fidelis Oditah, Queens Counsel and Senior Advocate of Nigeria, joins me now in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you.
We have tried at different levels of Arise News to get you in. You're a hard man to catch, busy, but thank you for coming in. And I've heard it said that you went into law because you thought it was going to equip you to earn a good living and also be of service to people. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is largely accurate, but also I was affected to a degree by the fact that a number of my very good friends at Federal Government College, Warri, in 1981, or 81, were considering law as a subject to study at the university.
And was that a decision you made on your own? In other words, did you have the typically pushy Nigerian parents deciding your career for you, or you decided you were going to go into law?
My parents did not influence me at all in my choice of law. On the contrary, my parents were somewhat skeptical about my choice of law for a number of reasons. First, they thought I spoke very softly. And were doubtful
they were used to fairly sort of aggressive. Of course, there are different branches of law, but
Absolutely,
I mean, they were used to sort of the aggressive types.
Yes, and they saw, I think, at that time, people like Ganifa Emi on television,
yes, of
very
course.
aggressive, and they thought that I was too gentle for that profession. But also, there was a feeling which is not supported by evidence, that lawyers were prone to die young, and they were concerned for my own future if I...
In other words, the job was too stressful.
It was too stressful.
Right.
But notwithstanding the misgivings, and they decided to support me once I insisted that I was going to study law.
But did you, at that stage, decide that you were not going to be a sort of barrister at law? In other words, a criminal lawyer. You were not going to be going to court to, stand up and be aggressive as they possibly feared?
I must say, from prior to getting to university, I was very interested in criminal law, because I think for most people, what they see of a law is primarily the criminal law.
Absolutely.
And I think, in fact, in some respects, prior to the advent of television, the criminal lawyers were the main celebrities that people knew.
Absolutely.
So from that point of view, as a child, I was attracted to criminal law and practice. But once I got to the university, I found that my calling was in commerce and corporate law, and not at all criminal law. And I haven't looked back since then. So I haven't really focused to any degree as a professional lawyer in the criminal branch of the law. Occasionally, I do civil aspects of money laundering, but I think that's the most I have had encounter with the criminal law.
And so you went to the University of Lagos.
I did, yes.
And you broke records, you won prizes for academic achievement, but you obviously wanted more. And in the end, your accomplishments led to a scholarship.
Yes, when I was in Unilag, University of Lagos, I thought about postgraduate studies immediately after the youth service. And I was looking at Oxford, I was looking at Harvard, I was looking at London College of, London College of Political School of London School of Economics and Political Science, and I was also looking at Cambridge. I think in 1986, when I was going to Oxford, I had admissions from Harvard, Cambridge, and Oxford.
I was going to ask you, why Oxford? I know a lot of people who went to Cambridge, relatives, people, but I also know people who went to Oxford.
Yes.
And I've always wondered what it is that decides you to go to one or the other.
I think I read a little about Oxford, I read a little about Cambridge from the library, the law school library, and also the University of Lagos library, and immediately I fell in love with both institutions. I was pushed to a degree towards Cambridge by a former tutor of mine, Dr. Kole Abayomi, who himself had graduated with a PhD from Cambridge. And I applied to Cambridge, and I was admitted to Cambridge for the same program that I was admitted to Oxford. But at the time, crucially, I had acquaintances who were at Oxford, and in particular, one of them was at Magdalen College, Oxford.
I used, it's very funny. I was just thinking of what most people who don't know Oxford will say Magdalen College, but it's Magdalen College.
It's Magdalen College.
It's very funny. I used to actually go there and spend nights at Magdalen College.
Right.
I wasn't at Oxford,
Yes.
but I had some very good friends there.
Yes. So Soji Elias, who was in law school with me, had a younger brother, Femi Elias, who was going to be in his final year, the year I was arriving. And also he had an elder brother who is now Professor Bola Elias, who was about to complete his PhD at the time I was arriving. So I had those two fellows who were, one was a postgraduate student completing his doctorate, and the other was an undergraduate going into final year, both of them lawyers. And so, although it was a very close call between Cambridge and Oxford, in the end, I decided to go to Oxford and advise the Commonwealth Scholarship Commission to divert my scholarship to Oxford.
But you were at you weren't at Magdalen. You were at Merton College. Were you?
I was a postgraduate student at Magdalen for 3 years.
Okay.
And then I became a fellow in 1989 at Merton. But because you cannot be a member of two colleges, I had to move from Magdalen to Merton.
Yes, yes. Well, Merton is it's obviously a very well-respected college. But I was much more familiar with Magdalen and more familiar with Cambridge, because my father had gone to Cambridge, and there had been St. John's, my cousins, and all that sort of thing. But it's remarkable what you have achieved, because in that 3-year period, you ended up with not just your master's degrees and all that, but with a Doctor of Philosophy, a doctorate degree in law within a space of 2 years. That is an absolutely remarkable achievement, and I want to talk about that. And you were in your 20s when you got to Oxford. I mean, was it a big challenge transitioning from the University of Lagos to Oxford, arguably one of the best universities in the world, with world-class facilities, world-class teachers, world-class, hugely competitive students? And I understand that the education you brought with you had not been pursued at the level of depth which your master's program at Oxford assumed and indeed required of you.
That is correct. I was well taught at the University of Lagos. But when I got to Oxford, I found very quickly that a lot of what I had learnt was superficial. And at Oxford required me to engage at a deeper level. And that was the first challenge. Secondly, of course, there was a challenge that I didn't really hear properly what some of the lecturers said, because not all of them are English, and you have to try and train your ears
of course,
to understand what it is that they were saying. But the latter wasn't such a serious challenge. It was the first one, which was, for example, that I had done contract law at the University of Lagos. I had done equity and trust. When I came to study restitution in Oxford, which assumed a degree of knowledge of contracts and equity, I just found significant gaps in my knowledge, which I had to plug in my first term at Oxford. But happily, it didn't take much.
Well, it took a superhuman brain like yours, because for any other person, that would have been a tremendous... I mean, you do admit that it was a challenge, though.
It was, but I think most systems... Well, people face different challenges. That was a knowledge gap. As a 22-year-old, it was significant because people were talking about things which I was supposed to have known, but which I did not know. Not because my teachers refused to teach me, but simply because that wasn't how those subjects were taught.
But did that cause you to question yourself? Because, I mean, here you were coming from the University of Lagos. You'd graduated first class. I mean, throughout your career, you were top of your class. Every academic prize achievable you'd won at Unilag. And then here you are, you get to Oxford, and suddenly you're sort of fencing around when everyone else seems to be ahead of you.
I wasn't in any doubt about my own ability. I just felt that I had not been exposed to certain areas of the law. I mean, just to give you an example, in relation to contract law, the curriculum at University of Lagos devoted about a week or two, which meant 1 or 2 lectures to remedies, whether you got damages, specific performance, or injunction, or some other specific relief. In contrast, Oxford spent 50% of the curriculum on remedies. So when you come to Oxford and you want to study remedies in contract and tort or restitution, and all you have studied in Lagos in terms of remedies was 1 lecture or 2.
Yeah, that does put you at a disadvantage.
It does put you at a significant disadvantage because some of the people you are competing with had spent about 3 or 4 months studying remedies, and here you are trying to have to read what you were supposed to have learned previously so as to equip yourself to be able to cope with the new knowledge that is being communicated to you. But as I said, I was able to overcome that shortcoming by the end of the first term because I stayed behind to teach myself English contract law and the principles of equity.
That's where discipline comes in, isn't it? You discipline yourself to simply put in as much more as you possibly can to try and make up for the shortfall.
I had no choice. For me, it was either I swam or I sank, and I wasn't prepared
That wasn't an option.
I wasn't prepared to come and be the first person to sink. Why would I?
Yeah.
I knew that I was able to cope with the course, but that there were significant gaps in my knowledge, and therefore the subjects or the courses assumed knowledge which I did not possess. So although I had a degree which certified that I had studied contract, equity, and trust, the content of those courses as taught to me at the University of Lagos did not necessarily make me competitive at the outset.
Well, we're glad you didn't sink, otherwise there'd be no point having you on the program, would there? But I mean, you talked about the other challenge, which was tuning your ear to sort of the different accents that you simply were not used to, sort of international accents outside the African sort of province, if you like. Was there also a difference in culture that you had to contend with? Was there something of a culture shock that, given that you'd never really lived outside Nigeria previously?
There was, but I think Oxford is very cosmopolitan, was very cosmopolitan in the 80s, still is very cosmopolitan. I think for the most part, the students and the tutors are very open-minded, and I didn't find that there was any significant obstacle in getting assimilated into the Oxford way of life. Sometimes people ask you, did you feel discrimination? It's difficult to tell as a student because every human being has his own biases and prejudices, and there must be tutors who would not like you for whatever reason.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
And there were
but of course, you don't
like
necessarily construe that they don't like you because of your color or your ethnicity.
Absolutely. So I don't take refuge in race as a reason for people's actions. Sometimes, of course, you have to accept that someone is bigoted and is doing it because. I remember one particular lecturer, a tutor, who was very silly. And he used to say I was enigmatic. Perhaps he was right. I did not like him, he did not like me, and there were times I went to his room for tutorials and I just ignored him and looked through the window at the high streets watching cars, and he knew that I was.
But you know, that's the thing about, that's why a lot of parents in Nigeria say, let the child grow up to a certain point where they become culturally confident
Yes.
in where they're coming from before we expose them to a different culture, particularly a culture that oftentimes is racist.
Yes.
It makes you more vulnerable when you're in those countries at a younger age, because then you question where you belong and who you are. But you had no doubts about who you were, and that strengthened your capacity to deal with whatever challenges there were.
Yes, I was very confident. I think that helps me.
Sure.
I was very confident as a young man when I got to Oxford in '86. I was perhaps a little abrasive, very direct, but that reflected the approach in Lagos. In the early to mid '80s, people were very direct. They spoke frankly, they shot from the hip. And so when I got to Oxford, I wasn't used to people who
Being polite.
Who...
But also the classic English double speak.
Exactly. I just said it as it was. If I did not agree, I just said I did not agree. Or if I thought you were wrong, I said I think you are wrong. Whereas after 2 or 3 years, in fact, after a few months, not 2 or 3 years, I learned that it was better to say, well, could we look at the problem from this perspective?
Yes, absolutely. That's a much more English way of looking at things,
Yes.
I'm afraid.
And that was far more agreeable because I had managed to alienate quite a lot of people by my direct Lagos approach.
How, in spite of those challenges that you faced going from Nigeria to the UK, and not just anywhere, but to Oxford, that you were still able to complete a number of degrees in a space of 3 years and complete those with distinction?
Well, there were two factors that perhaps more than any other accounted for that. The first is that I had a 3-year scholarship, which meant I had to complete my program within 3 years or become self-funding.
I like that.
And
I can see that being an incentive.
And I knew from some of the Nigerians I met and some of the Africans I met in Oxford that once you become self-funding, then you tend to lose focus. And
Yes.
the PhD or doctorate could easily become a 5-6 year undertaking. And I met people when I got to Oxford who had spent about 5-6 years on the
Trying to
get a doctorate. So that was the first reason. The second reason was that, luckily for me, in the second year of my doctorate, in fact, on the 25th of March, 1989, 2 days before my 25th birthday, I was appointed to a permanent teaching position in Oxford.
Yes, that was that was at Merton College.
It was at Merton. It
Right.
was a new position funded by a city firm called Travers Smith, who were experts in corporate law. They had given some money, I think about £500,000 at that time, to Oxford University to create a lectureship in corporate finance law with a fellowship at Merton. Initially, I thought I was going to be supervised by whoever got that. But then at some point, one of my supervisors asked why I did not want to apply. I thought it was a bit presumptuous of me, who was struggling to complete a doctorate. In fact, I was in the second year, had maybe about 14-15 months into my doctorate to apply to become a teacher myself. But he said, well, there was never any downside. It's either you were invited for interview or you weren't. So based on that, I put in my application and I was invited for an interview. I was very surprised to find myself invited. Of course, I had never taught corporate law anywhere. I had never taught corporate finance anywhere. But I knew that in order to persuade the interviewers that in spite of my Nigerian accent, they should give me a chance to set up that course. I had to persuade them that I was capable of of establishing the subject, because most of those who were invited for interview were teaching corporate finance in other universities such as Warwick, Bristol. So I needed to outperform them. And the way that I did that was to put together what I called a provisional outline for a corporate finance course at the master's level. and I broke it down into 8 topics, which is typical Oxford 8 weeks, and divided it into share financing, debt financing, corporate acquisitions, insider trading, and then the duties of financial intermediaries. And did this and typed it up and went to the interview with 6 copies. So I went to my interview and I was asked how I was going to, what I knew about corporate finance, and I said I was writing my doctorate on receivables financing, which wasn't quite corporate finance, but that I had thought about a possible outline for the new course. So I distributed my handouts to the 5 interviewers, and then for the rest of the interview, we were discussing what I gave them rather than them asking me any questions.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That is brilliant. I must use that sometime in the future. But then, as I said, I mean, having done all that, became a tutor at Merton, which is a very, distinguished position to have. I mean, you also subsequently established a successful private legal practice.
Yes, and I'll tell you why. I decided at a fairly early stage as a full-time tutor at Oxford that I needed to gain practical experience. In part, I was encouraged by Travers Smith, the firm of solicitors that donated the money. They invited me from time to time to come give them lectures. They also gave me a few things to do as a consultant, practical issues. And that exposure convinced me that I needed to marry academic and practical law. I found that there was great scope to teach if you actually knew what problems confronted the practitioners.
Yeah.
So that was the first reason.
point.
But the second reason was financial, because at the point I had just bought a flat, and the UK had managed to crash out of the ERM, the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, and interest rates had gone from 8% to 16%. And I found that my salary wasn't enough to cover my mortgage, and therefore that I could not stay there and pray and hope that something will happen. I had to take steps to augment my salary, and that was the second reason why I went in. And for me, going into South Square was an easy choice, because in the late 80s and early 90s, it was a place to be. Most of the biggest cases in the UK were in South Square. There was BCCI, there was Polypec, there was British and Commonwealth, there was Bearings, everything was there. And so for me, it was an easy choice. They did a lot of banking that I liked, and they did high-end corporate insolvency. And for me, the interaction of banking and corporate insolvency was a dream package, because whilst I was teaching company law, corporate finance, contracts and trusts at Oxford, the ability to see corporate insolvency, which at that time wasn't taught at Oxford, and the interaction between contracts, law of personal property, and insolvency was fantastic, because often you find that insolvency is the most exacting test, because in insolvency everyone is claiming a piece of a pie.
Absolutely.
And by definition the pie is insufficient. So you stretch those legal principles to see how robust they are.
So here you are. I mean, you'd come to the UK, you were not British, you were not ethnically really related to anyone. I mean, you just came, and on the strength of your personal ability, you were able to achieve everything you achieved. Do you think you would have had that same opportunity, the capacity to do things if you had remained in Nigeria? Tricky question, eh?
Well, I think, the question has several aspects. The first point I think you mentioned is merit. The UK system is still largely driven by merit.
Yeah, the meritocracy.
It's a meritocracy, whereas in Nigeria, at least today, if not in the 80s, and it's difficult to know what would have happened if I came back.
Yes, of course.
In 1989, instead of staying back to teach in Oxford. But the Nigeria today is characterized by a disdain for merit and a race to the bottom, and the entrenchment of mediocrity, under various guises as federal character, religion, ethnic differences, but really the result is the enthronement of mediocrity at the expense of merit. So it's possible that if I were in Nigeria, I wouldn't have achieved what I achieved, because you cannot do very much in Nigeria without assistance, if I may put it that way. It's possible, but I would say that it would have been more difficult. But of course, I came back at the time I did, and the competition was different, because having done it in the UK, there was very little to prove in Nigeria. But I have found that since I came back, that I have had some pretty good things, largely by merit.
Having already had that track record.
Having already had that track record. And it's a moot question whether, had I started from the beginning of my legal career in Nigeria, I would have had the same success.
Sure. Well, I mean, I want to talk about your impressions and your experiences in Nigeria since you got back in the final segment, which is coming up after this. But I just want to briefly touch on the fact that you were talked about in the UK at one stage as a possible Attorney General, the first black one. Was that something you had ambition for?
In fairness, I did not have any ambition to be Attorney General. I thought that going into UK public service, even in that limited sense, would be constraining. I wanted to come back to Nigeria. And while I thought that being considered for the UK Attorney General was a good endorsement, a small recognition, nonetheless, it wasn't something that I really desired or craved, and therefore I took no steps to actualize it. And on the contrary, I made it clear that I wanted to come back to Nigeria. And when I decided in 2005 to come back, most people thought I was mad. Why would someone leave UK at the peak of his career to come back?
That's an interesting point. Let me just emphasize, it was aspirant.
It was.
You didn't quite get to the stage of candidate.
No, I never became a candidate.
Right. And you did not become Attorney General either. As you mentioned before we went on a break, you didn't really pursue it, even though it was mentioned, and mentioned in very credible circles in the UK. You left and you decided that you were going to repair to Nigeria. Did you think or feel that after all the years you spent in the UK, you were out of touch with the realities in Nigeria?
Not really. At the time that I came back in 2006, I had been out of Nigeria for about 20 years. But I had been coming to Nigeria, in some cases up to 3 or 4 times a year. But those visits, as I found subsequently, did not prepare me for the ruts that I met in Nigeria. And I think nothing can ever prepare you for the ruts that you see in Nigeria.
And
I knew there were problems.
Particularly of Nigerian politics.
Of Nigerian politics, and the role of godfathers, and the fact that the electorates were insincere. They want change, but they want to be paid to come for rallies. They want to be paid to vote at delegate elections. They want to be paid to vote at general elections. And really it was all money, 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 money. And I had managed at the time to spend almost £2 million of my own money just trying to run to get the delegates to enable me stand as a candidate. I never did stand as a candidate because my £2 million was just a tiny drop in the ocean compared to the monies that people were ready to spend at the time, but of course, and they actually spent.
But I mean, you must have had some sense of what you were getting into, and yet you took the plunge. you had to face, I mean, not only the financial bit, but lots of internecine battles. I mean, you run under the PDP, didn't
Yes.
you? Within that PDP in Delta State.
There were many problems, but one has got to be realistic. You won't expect anything good without a fight or a challenge. I knew that there were problems, but as far as I was concerned, the state needed better governance. And although James Sibori was my friend, he's still my friend, I thought that I could perhaps do better than he had done at the time. And I could see very, very many areas where I had a passion for, where my skills could have helped the state to move forward from where he stopped it. But the political gladiators in Delta State were not having any part of it. Initially, my aspiration was boosted by President Obasanjo's support. He provided tacit support for it, encouraged it, but of course, it wasn't enough to deliver the ticket.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I mean, I want to sort of move a little bit forward because there have been quite a number of developments recently with the judiciary, the removal of the Chief Justice, the Supreme Court making decisions that are viewed as controversial, political sort of electoral decisions to do with elections and so on. When you look at the legal profession and the judiciary in Nigeria today, what do you see amid things like, as I said, the removal of the Chief Justice, allegations of a politicized Supreme Court, and allegations of a corrupt legal system?
When I look at the Nigerian judicial system, what do I find? I see a judiciary that is very constrained in very many ways. Some of it is lack of capacity, some is lack of infrastructure, some is due to an excessive focus on the procedural aspects of adjudication. And you find that there's insufficient engagement with substantive law, or what you might call substantive justice, very poor funding, very poor fiscal infrastructure. The courts are just a mess. The registries don't work. But in that darkness, I also see men and women who are trying to do their best.
In spite of the challenges.
In spite of these challenges. And of course, one has to remember that bad news spreads very quickly. Whereas if you're doing the right thing, no one reports it. But if you do the wrong thing, everyone reports it. That's the first point. The second point is that because judges perform their function in the public, which itself is the essence of the concept of open justice, that justice must be done in the open so that the people who are the masses can see how a very important organ of government performs, not just in secret, but in the public, so that they can be subject to criticism and appraisal. That itself creates a major problem because often people who are unsuccessful criticize judges, sometimes fairly, but most often unfairly. And you could look at what's happened in Imo and Bayelsa as an example of that, and why the Supreme Court refused to. Of course, for many people, the Supreme Court's judgment in Imo is completely erroneous, completely erroneous.
And for you?
And for me, I believe it is erroneous as well. I also believe that the Supreme Court decision in Bayelsa is just as erroneous. I can see how you can get there, because on one hand, you ask yourself, is it the supremacy of the electoral mandate, or is it the perception of the supremacy of some technical rules that you're looking at? If you had a blank slate and you were trying to write a system,
Right.
you could choose whether to have the supremacy of the will of the people and then find how you get there. Or you might say, these are the rules, and these rules must be complied with.
Right.
Each of those positions expresses a particular preference and a particular legal policy.
Right, okay. Let me just say this, we are out of time, but it's been absolutely brilliant having you here. Fidelis Oditah, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Do join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.